little did I know at the time when I was in the congregation in Pahiatua that there was a perpetrator who was part of a sex ring. And the worst thing, I allowed my own son to go and stay with him.
Shayne Mechen, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from your home in Palmerston North, New Zealand. You are a former member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, born into the group and eventually becoming an elder before deciding to leave. You are now an activist speaking out against high control groups such as the JWs and an advocate for support and therapy for those affected by their experiences. Welcome to the show, Shayne. You recently attended the Decult conference in Christchurch, hosted by recent Talk Beliefs guest Anke Richter. That must have been an interesting experience.
It was certainly an interesting experience. I didn't really know what was going to happen. In the room, though, it became very clear that the ones that were in that room, they really have a desire to be able to start the progress to educate not only themselves but New Zealand as to the damage and the harm that these organisations do.
Well, you grew up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and from the very beginning, it was all you knew. So, what was day-to-day life like for you as a JW, and what led you to become an elder?
Day-to-day life. Well, to me, it was normal. You get dragged along to where your parents go, and that certainly happened. I remember going into Kingdom Halls, and there wasn't much carpet in the Napier Kingdom Hall. That's where I grew up. So we would lie on the vinyl tiles on a Thursday evening. Tuesday evening, we had another meeting, and Sunday. So most of the time, if we weren't knocking on the doors, and that would happen generally on a Saturday and a Sunday. So there was no time for sports, even though I loved it. Wasn't allowed to play sport unless it was at school, and not after hours, but in school hours. So we did play a little bit of sport, but some of the experiences that I remember, some were quite horrible because it was more bullying. They all knew I was a Jehovah's Witness, and some of the worst bullies were JW kids, believe it or not. There was one guy, he would come up, he would spit at me, and yet his mum was a JW. He'd been to the Kingdom Hall. He, those sorts of things come back to you over time. Other things that we never did, birthdays. We couldn't go to parties at school. I can only remember going to one school camp, even though the school camp would happen quite regularly. We just never got involved in school. I can think of maybe two people that I would have considered at the time, two friends. We were just told, nope, you're not having anything to do with them after school. You're not going to have them coming over because they're worldly, and you just never got close to anybody. So my older school friend, they would have been the Jehovah's Witness children that I went to school with. There was no non-JW children that I would have considered being friends of any sort of description. So that's sort of a brief summary of some of the things as I was growing up we would do. Like during the school holidays, my parents, well, predominantly my father, he would go, Shayne, you could go out knocking on doors, arrange with one of the older ones and go witnessing. And that would happen sometimes. Other times I'd just go fishing. But it wasn't with friends, it was just by myself or who I met down at the wharf where we'd go fishing. So when I left school, so I left at the age of 15, I didn't actually like school. I didn't like reading. I didn't like spelling. I didn't like math. What I did like was PE, sport, and computers were coming in, and I really enjoyed those two things. But during the early stages, I was never meant to go to school. And so education to me was really a waste of time. And my father, he encouraged me to what was called auxiliary pioneering. And at the time, it's a lot less now, but at the time it was 60 hours. And he strongly encouraged me to go and fill out the forms, auxiliary pioneering forms, and do 60 hours per month knocking on doors and speaking to ones that I might have left a bit of literature with, and go back. They're called return visits, and try and encourage them to start looking at the Bible and studying it. So I did that for 6 months, and then I became a regular pioneer. And at the time, a regular pioneer was to do 90 hours per month. I forget the yearly, I think might have been 970 hours per month, per year, to be able to meet the requirement. And I did that for nearly 5 years. During that period of time, I became a ministerial servant, which is sort of like an assistant to the elders, where they could get you to do meeting parts, handle microphones, accounts, look after the magazines and other areas in the Kingdom Hall. And when I was in a place called Dannyburg, I was appointed as a ministerial servant, and I was there for about 18 months. Moved from Dannyburg, and something which we'll talk about later, I found what I thought was a girlfriend, and it's when I look back on it, I never knew anything to do with anything with females. What I mean by that is the publications that you can see in the back of the room, they outline what a woman would look for in a potential marriage mate, and that was a male who was knocking on the door regularly. They were reaching out to become ministerial servant. They were answering. They were active as a Jehovah's Witness. And it was very similar to me looking at a prospective female to become a marriage mate. But looking back on it, I really had no idea. I was too young, and I don't know what I was going to be doing in my life, but it was sort of expected that, and they did push it, that, you don't go and commit fornication because that's a no-no, and you're better off to get married to be able to not commit that sin. And I followed all the right things. I looked at what I was encouraged to do. When I say the right things, I mean the JW things, or the JW view of how it should be done. And the next step followed.
You married within the JWs and had 2 children. To the hardcore faithful within the religion, this would seem to have cemented your commitment to the group. But marrying within the JWs was a big reason as to why you decided to leave. Isn't that right?
In the end, it certainly played a big part. I mentioned before, they encouraged a male and a female to look at spiritual qualities, but it doesn't set you up really to understand or to get to know the one you're going to live with the rest of your life. I look back on it, I was certainly naive. I was scared of females. I wouldn't really speak to them. I know I'm laughing about it now, but at the time you just went with the flow. They encourage you to do things by means of the Watchtower magazine and what was in there, and you just followed it. So at the time, I didn't want to get married until I got reappointed as a ministerial servant in a place called Johnsonville, and that happened. I then got married in August 1989, I think it was, in a place called Lower Hutt, and that's where my then wife, that was her congregation. We moved to Johnsonville. We then, about 18 months later, moved to a place called Pahiatua. Now, the circuit overseer, which is a person that looks after and oversees congregations, encouraged us to move there because there was a need. Where the need was great. In other words, there wasn't enough preachers to knock on doors. And because I wanted to, I was always encouraged to follow the encouragement. We moved, and it took 2 weeks. We were there, found a house, and then we continued to struggle because in a little place there wasn't much work. So our life in Pahiatua, we had no children. 2 children came along, girl first, then a boy. And around that period of time, after my son was born, I was appointed as an elder in 1995. I was 27, 28, I can't remember the exact time, which is on the younger side of when they used to appoint elders. So that happened. I was already, as a ministerial servant, and because there was a lack of brothers, already doing a lot of the elder sort of jobs in the congregation. Even when I was a ministerial servant, I would take what you call the theocratic ministry school, which is normally taken by an elder, and they felt comfortable in using me in that position and a number of other positions in the congregation as well. So I became an elder. The congregation changed. One role that I particularly enjoyed had to do with the door knocking, the preaching work. It was called the service overseer, and he was responsible to look after the area, making sure it was being covered as best we could. And at one time we had 8 regular pioneers, which for a small congregation was very good. Per publisher ratio. Publisher is a normal Jehovah's Witness, and regular pioneers would go knocking on the doors all the time.
You finally left the group at age 42 by writing what is known as a letter of disassociation. Shayne, what led you to this decision, and what was the aftermath of exiting such a high demand religion?
What led to that? Life, burnout, pressure. I'd been in a situation where for a long period of time I became the only elder. Looking back on it, I was unhappy. The things that were going on in my personal life, I was using the JW as an elder to keep myself busy so that I could make myself scarce in my personal life and keep up with doing what was required of you as an elder. And quite often when I look back on it, I go, how the hang did I even accomplish anything in my personal life because of the things that they expect you to do? So you'd go out and see other families. You'd be doing meeting parts. You would be doing a whole lot of other things, setting the right example by knocking on doors. I truly believed as an elder I should have set the right example, and that's what I did. The children both got baptized when they were, I think my daughter was 12, and yes, that's way too young. She doesn't at the time know anything about anything, like me when I was growing up. No idea. My son is still a current JW, and it's one of those things that when I look back on it, I, even as an elder, I had doubts. But I remember my first doubt, and we were at a district convention in Hastings, and I stood up to my father and said, "Dad, I don't think we should do this." And he said to me, "Oh, Shane, let's talk about it when we get home." Okay, that's fine. Went and did it. And what I discovered looking back on it through my whole time as growing up as a ministerial servant, as an elder, I had doubts, and I never once questioned the doubts that I had. It was like, oh, she'll be right. Just set the right example. You don't want to show that you might be lacking in faith. So just keep on going. And that's what I did. There were times that were quite hard, and you'd have to put a mask on. You'd have to set an example. You'd have to get out there, get up on the stage, regardless of how you were feeling, and do what you could do. And so when I left at the age of 42, like you said, I wrote my disassociation letter. It was going to be an easier way to stop an influence in my life from getting too bad. And that's what I did. It worked. The influence slowed down. And then I took the next step of, not that you want this to happen, but divorcing my wife. I left the children there because at the time I thought the Jehovah's Witnesses was a sort of okay organization. It's all I ever knew. And then I left. I was there for my children. My daughter, she as a teenager was starting to question, was starting to wonder, was starting to go, And so she left, and well, actually, she came up to Palmerston North with me, and over the time she grew further away from the JWs, but not totally, because she did want to have a study. So that's when the knock on the door. At the moment, they're really pushing Bible studies, and nobody would do that really, apart from a woman in the Upper Hutt congregation who is no longer a JW. She's actually out, and she's a lovely woman. But my daughter's mum said, "Oh no, you can't do that because this person is starting to become an apostate, bad influence." And so that left my daughter. She came to not really run away, but she got out of there. She came up to Palmerston North. She found a boyfriend. She got pregnant, was down in Gore. Her mother went to visit her, and next minute, she was kicked out of the organization. And so my daughter, over the next 18 months, 2 years, was out of it. But then she goes, well, maybe I should go back. She went back. She got reinstated. So that's when she became a Jehovah's Witness again. And then she discovered there was something lacking. The JWs, the Jehovah's Witnesses, say they have love amongst themselves, like a lot of religions. And my daughter goes, there's no love there, Dad. Now, she told me that there was a series of events where my daughter, and this is how I remember it, she sent me a text. "Dad, do you remember sending postcards when you were away for work?" And so I texted back and I said, "Oh, what's the message for?" I never heard back from her. 2 weeks later, my daughter rings me and says, "Dad, can we go out for lunch?" Now, in my head, I was thinking, oh no, she's going to try and get me back. So I said, okay, let's go and have lunch. She never asked any questions. We dropped her off and she goes, Dad, I'd like to ask some questions. And I said, well, you won't like my answers. And she said, oh, okay then, and hopped out the van. The third thing that happened was I get a friend Facebook request and I'm going, what's going on here? So instead of accepting it, I waited outside her house on the road, nearly 4 hours, and she didn't turn up. So I thought, right, I'm going to go home and dinner. And I sent her a message as I was heading back, parked outside, message sent. And I said, are you home? She goes, yes. Knocked on the door. Now, the questions my daughter wanted to ask me was, why did you leave? And it took me by surprise because here I was thinking she wants to get me back. So after about 4 hours of sitting there and talking about the things that I had learnt that I was part of, she was ready to leave as well. And she could not understand how an organization was protecting pedophiles. And I knew one, little did I know, at the time when I was in the congregation in Pahiatua, that there was a perpetrator who was part of a sex ring. And the worst thing, I allowed my own son to go and stay with him. Fortunately, as far as I know, well, my son told me nothing had ever happened. That perpetrator, alleged perpetrator, better get that right, is now dead. And we did manage to get a confession and he fronted up, yes, he had done it. He did that confession in front of one of his victims, which helped that victim. So that sort of information I told my daughter because she knew that individual. And there was a number of other things which I showed her from publicly, not in the JW stuff, but publicly available on the internet. Court documents, tax documents, they're pretty accurate because they've all got to be up there and you can find them on the internet. So she wrote her letter. She was gone. After, when she got back from Scotland, she was visiting one of her best friends who was a JW, but then also left. And when she got back, she stood in my office and she goes, Dad, poof, my whole belief structure's now gone. And I said, yeah, I know. And that's when her life started. My life started a little bit before that, even though I had left when I was 42. It took me 7-8 years to ask or give myself permission to ask my first question. And that led to me finding out a lot of what I then knew and led me down the path where I do know a lot of things from their own publications and other sources which I could not have believed I was part of as a Jehovah's Witness.
In 2018, you worked with the New Zealand Royal Commission into responses to child sex abuse. Shayne, how did your involvement come about and what were the recommendations for change that you offered?
How it came about was one of the things that happened early on was in this publication here. That's the secret elders handbook. And women aren't allowed to touch this book. They're not allowed to look at it. If a person was to go and put binding on like this, the elder would have to stand by the person and he would have to oversee the binding of that publication. Now, in that publication, it said that an elder could stay an elder if years before he had done something wrong and it appeared that he had God's Holy Spirit blessing his life. Well, to that sort of wording. And I went, hell no. What's that about? Because if a Jehovah's Witness, normal Jehovah's Witness was to, say, commit adultery or some other sin according to their viewpoint, they could get kicked out. If they weren't repentant, out they've gone. And yet in the elder's book, it said that an elder could stay an elder if it appeared he had God's Holy Spirit, if years before he had done something similar. And I went, what? That was one of the early things that woke me up. And I had never heard of the Australian Royal Commission. And I'm going, what's this all about? And it said in there that they basically protecting pedophiles. And I go, no, they don't. This book tells me what I needed to do. And I would follow that publication, and you'd ring the service department, you'd do everything. But little did I understand those rules. Not once did they encourage you to go to the police. You ring the service department, then the service department gives you the instruction to follow through on what they want you to do. Now, here in New Zealand, we don't have mandatory child reporting. So in the publication that came out in 2019, which is this Watchtower, and it's their view on child sex abuse, they said that they follow the country's rules. And it makes it sound like that the service department will make the elders go to the police. And just a minute, that's not going to happen here in New Zealand because we don't have mandatory child reporting. And so the elders book saying that the Watchtower putting their view of things out there, which made it sound that Jehovah's Witnesses, the leadership, would do everything that they could to get the help. Well, it's a word salad. It means very little when it comes to actual action of the JW leadership. And this still happens now. So that was the early stages that I started waking up and I'm going, you've got to be kidding. Then a document was released, not only here in Australia, New Zealand, because New Zealand's under the Australia branch. They released a letter telling all elders to get rid of and destroy their personal notes of cases that they have served on with regards to child abuse. Fortunately, I had never served on a child abuse case. Not only that, but they also changed the form, because when somebody gets disfellowshipped, you used to have a form with all sorts of details on that form of what the sin was that determined whether they would get disfellowshipped or not. So that was then changed. So when we got that letter, we sent it off, and this is where my involvement with trying to help the Royal Commission started. We sent that letter off to make sure they were aware of what the Jehovah's Witnesses were doing here in New Zealand. Then 6 weeks later, I was speaking to a gentleman on Radio New Zealand called Phil Pennington. That was the first time in my living memory that Jehovah's Witnesses were starting to get in the news. And it was that letter. And he said, why have I not heard about this before? I said, well, we gave it to the Royal Commission 6 weeks ago. And so he contacted the Royal Commission. Royal Commission basically said, yes, we've told them not to destroy any documents because we're going to need them. And from that point on, we started to share things with Radio New Zealand and a few other media outlets. And also, I wasn't the only one, but former Jehovah's Witnesses would send the Royal Commission information from their publications to be able to educate the Commission and hopefully the lawyers of how Jehovah's Witnesses manipulate bits and pieces in a commission situation. And they certainly did that. A document that came out in a court case when they appealed. Was that the appeal? One of the court cases anyway, where it said they had contacted one of the New Zealand corporations with regards to Jehovah's Witnesses. They had 3 at the time, and the head of Watchtower Australia said, you need to go to Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, Australasia. So that's what the Royal Commission did. Now, in the documents that were from the court, Jehovah's Witnesses said, we have no records of child abuse. And I'm going, well, I know that's not true because we have evidence that it actually did happen. Now, the problem we have with that statement is what they call CCJWA, Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, Australasia, were not in existence in that time. So the Royal Commission basically was from 50s to 1999. That organisation, CCJWA, did not exist. So technically, they had no records. And I'm going, ugh. And so they distracted the New Zealand Royal Commission into abuse, because it wasn't just child sexual abuse, it was all sorts of abuses, whether it was mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, or medically. And you just stood there and shaking your head when Watchtower deliberately deceived the Royal Commission so they could hide information. And they did it all the time, because when they went to court, they were saying, we don't have bricks and mortar buildings. We do not come within scope of our Royal Commission. While they don't have bricks and mortar buildings, in their own publications, they have men who are elders in pictures looking after fatherless boys. In other words, they might be no parent, no father, or they could be a father, but he's not a Jehovah's Witness. And so they would encourage the elders, that's Watchtower leadership, to look after these ones. And these ones, like myself, I know I went out in a van full of young teenagers because that's what they encouraged us to do. And for them to say that they weren't in their care, well, leadership maybe not, but the elders in the congregation took that responsibility seriously. You know, there's a number of programs in the JWs, like the pioneers. So those ones who are knocking on the door, they were encouraged to grab a younger person and take them out knocking on doors to train them how to be better speakers. There were lots of different things, like at quick builds. The elders would help younger ones, and yes, younger ones were allowed on the site of their own congregation, helping prepare the site, get things ready for the building to be done. They were encouraged to do things as families. Like, you know, there might be a fatherless boy with no dad. So they would take them, they would go fishing. I've heard of people 10-pin bowling. Unfortunately, some people I know have been groomed by elders and been abused on assembly sites, in kingdom halls, in their own personal homes. So for them to say they don't take care of children, that is an outright lie, even though they'll say, no, we don't do that. In fact, in one of the court cases, my name was brought up and the Jehovah's Witness said, well, that's his way of dealing with things. It's not what the organisation, as Jehovah's Witnesses, would recommend. So they throw people under the bus. They will throw elders under the bus when most elders know that they're encouraged to look after and take care of children, young people, and unfortunately some of those men abuse the children and give them a life sentence.
Since leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses, you've not only amassed a large collection of JW literature, as we can see behind you, but have also become very much involved in activism. Shayne, can you tell us what you've been doing to educate others on cults, and what resources are there for people who have left such groups?
I started off with the Jehovah's Witness side of things. That was simply because that's what I knew. There was a period where I didn't even know it was a cult. These high control groups, whether you use the word cult or high control group, to me it was normal. I didn't even realize within the UN Charter there's an aspect of a person can choose their own religion. They have that choice. Jehovah's Witnesses don't have that choice. These high control groups take away your right, like in my case, as a citizen of New Zealand. They put out their own rights, and so some of the things that you get taken away from you, for an example, if you were to go to court, Jehovah's Witnesses are encouraged not to go to court. Do not take your brother to court. They view secular authority, like the police, as something to steer clear of. So some of these things to me were normal. I learnt that they're not normal. The shunning is not normal. Jehovah's Witnesses will stop you talking to your own family. Once again, it's really breaking a human right to keep with your family that communication level open. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses will stand up in court, and they did this in Canada. We do not shun. Family relations still carry on. It's just that spiritual gatherings or the spiritual side of things is not anything they do together. Well, it goes further than that, and I'll give you an example. I can't talk to my son. So if they don't shun, how come I can't talk to my child about every normal day things? Oh, that's right. The Jehovah's Witnesses say, do not make an excuse to go and spend time with your family. And you sit there going, that sort of thing we need to educate humanity about, because it doesn't matter if it's Jehovah's Witness, if it's what the 2x2s or the religion with no name, which I learned about at the cult, whether it's the Brethren, Gloria Vale, which we have here in New Zealand, all types of religion, they stop the ability to have major amounts of time with your children, with your relatives. You just aren't allowed. I've heard from a couple of people, one tonight, and he was worried about meeting his dad for the first time in many years because he refused to have anything to do with him. He knocked on the door, and to his surprise, he was able to have a conversation about things. And that's all because just recently they have changed wording on shunning. Well, they don't really use shunning, but to have things to do with ones who have been former members. Now they're allowed to give a greeting as they walk in the Kingdom Hall, whereas once before, nah, you weren't even to say a greeting. Now, the reason for those changes is in Europe, court case after court case is making people realize the harm that Jehovah's Witness religion is doing. Now, everybody's got the right to believe what they choose. Now, I'd never discourage anybody, even a Jehovah's Witness, from believing what they believe. But when there's harm, when there's abuse, that's when we need to draw the line. And I went to the Cult conference, which happened to be a week ago in Christchurch in New Zealand. And it's very clear that, like New Zealand, many other countries don't understand the damage that these high control groups do to their members or the public. like I do know from a Jehovah's Witness viewpoint, and even in this magazine, they say in small print, if you need to go and get a therapist, do so. But at one time, therapy was discouraged, and most people in these high control groups, Scientology, Gloriavale, they are discouraged from taking use of therapy. And so with all this sort of thinking that's happening, a lot of therapists really have no idea the little ins and outs of these organizations and their wording or their phrases or their policies. So much so that, like here in New Zealand, we've got a thing called ACC. Now, if it's classified correctly and a person has been abused, and a therapist, and I know this for sure from people who have told me, they have to explain the Jehovah's Witness mentality, their thinking, the use of certain words, and by the time the therapist gets a sort of grip on how to help that person, their free sessions are just about finished. So they're not getting the help they needed. Now, what we saw at the cult was, and it seemed to build over the 2 days because it went Saturday and Sunday, that people are now realizing there's a real need for therapists. But we don't have enough therapists. Like here in New Zealand, and this is just a scenario, whether it happens, I'm not sure. But if, say, 500 people were to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, the New Zealand health system with mental well-being and therapy could not handle 500 Jehovah's Witnesses if they came out of that organization. There's just not enough people who understand what people could do. It's really sad because religious trauma is just one of many problems that therapists need to handle. And the cult has started the conversation. They have started the conversation. I'll give you an example. There was Freedom from Religion, which is a wonderful organization started by a guy called Darryl Ray, Dr. Darryl Ray. He's brilliant. Now, they were there and they presented to the more than what they expected in the room. And they had a number of therapists come forward and say, we want to be part of your secular therapy program. Now, that is great, but there's still not enough of the therapists to be able to help so many organizations that these people are coming out of, and they're lost. They have lost their whole support system. In the JWs, the young ones that come out, they have such a high suicide rate that a lot of them kill themselves. A lot of them are feeling lonely. They don't know that there's, and like here in New Zealand and Australia, that there's an exjw community. In fact, we had a meetup on the Sunday after. 14 of those people did not know that there was an exjw community. 14 out of 17. And we met them at the Occult conference. That is a staggering figure. We will never know how many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses there are. The problem is, though, just because you leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, up here, they're still JW. And so sometimes, and I've known a couple of these, 30, 40, 50 years later, they've never done a search on the internet to find out about what the Jehovah's Witnesses are known for, other than door knocking and their smiles as they come to your door or stand at carts. And when something comes up, after all that period of time, they may have gone from leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses through their whole life, then they've got a happy life, something happens, and they spiral all the way back down to the time they just come out of the JWs. So they have to start, because of not doing the work that we definitely encourage now, they have to restart it again. and they will struggle, and they struggle, and then all of a sudden they're back down. It's really sad that these high control groups, and JWs by means are not the only one. Everybody who leaves these groups, because of their fear that has been installed in their thinking, therapists are danger to your faith. Far from it. They're there to help have a happy life, to be the person you are. And that's really came out very clear over the whole day. And so that's one side of things we do. The other side, which sort of goes back to the activism, we started this thing called JWS For Justice. And that's solely basically getting newspaper articles from around the world and highlighting to people the dangers within that high control group. Like myself, many Jehovah's Witnesses do not know, when I was in, that they had a child abuse problem. All we knew was the Jehovah's Witnesses bashed the Catholic Church because they're the ones who've got the child sex abuse problem. Well, per capita, to use the Australian figures that came out there, so 4,444 cases on the Catholic side, and if I remember correctly, 6 million Catholics. Jehovah's Witnesses have about 70,000 members, give or take, and they had 1,006 alleged people who have committed child abuse. So when you look at that, 6 million odd Catholics, 4,444 perpetrators. Jehovah's Witnesses, 70,000 and a quarter, just under a quarter of what the Catholics were. So per capita, Jehovah's Witnesses are by far worse than the Catholic Church. Even in exjw, which is in Britain, they found that the child abuse rate amongst Jehovah's Witnesses was higher than in Australia. So do they have a problem? They do, and it's a danger to humanity. But like I said, if somebody wants to be a Jehovah's Witness, do your research. Go and be a Jehovah's Witness if you want, but make sure you protect yourself and analyze what they're teaching you.
Your work is very important, Shane, and I'm grateful that you've been able to spare the time to come onto the show today. Next time, we'll be speaking to your daughter about her own perspective on living and leaving the JWs. But until then, Shayne Mechen, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having us, Mark. If I could just say one more thing. If a person out there is really struggling, look after yourself. Find a trusted friend. Work up to finding a therapist, because life can be really enjoyable away from these high control groups, unlike what they say. But please look after yourself. Enjoy life. Thanks, Mark.